The lockdown after the yard violence felt endless. Inside Attica Correctional Facility, silence did not mean peace. It meant pressure. Cell doors stayed closed longer than usual. Meals came late and cold. The lights stayed on all night, buzzing softly like insects that never slept. Daniel Brooks sat on his bunk, staring at the wall. His chest still felt tight from the tear gas. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the yard again, the running, the shouting, the way fear spread faster than sound. Attica had quieted down. But it had not calmed down. The prison never really did. Days passed slowly. Guards walked the tiers more often. Their boots echoed. Radios crackled. Every movement felt watched. Daniel noticed how guards paused longer at certain cells, mostly men from New York City, Buffalo, and Rochester. City inmates always drew attention. That attention created resentment. Resentment created anger. And anger always looked for a way out. Daniel shared his cell with a man named Marcus Hill, who had come from Rochester years earlier. Marcus was older, careful with his words, and knew Attica well. "They say this place learned after 1971, Marcus said one night. But all it learned was how to hold fear tighter." Daniel listened. Marcus told him stories of past lockdowns, of small fights that turned big because no one trusted anyone enough to slow down. "Once fear runs things," Marcus said, "rules stop mattering." Daniel thought about that a lot. When the lockdown eased, movement returned in pieces. First showers. Then short meals outside the cell. Finally, limited yard time. The first day back in the yard, Daniel felt exposed. The open space felt dangerous. He stayed near the fence, eyes moving constantly. Men from New York City grouped together. Men from Buffalo stood close. Rochester inmates stayed alert, watching both sides. No one mixed freely. The past had taught them not to. Guards watched from the towers and the ground. Their hands stayed close to their radios. Some looked tired. Some looked nervous. Daniel noticed one thing clearly. No one trusted anyone. Small moments became tests. A stare lasted too long. Someone brushed past another man. Words were spoken too sharply. Guards stepped in fast every time. Too fast, some inmates said. But guards remembered 1971 too, even if they had not been there. That history shaped their fear just as much. One afternoon, during work detail, Daniel saw an argument break out over cleaning supplies. It was nothing serious. Just words. Still, guards rushed in. The argument ended. The unit went into partial lockdown anyway. Inmates were angry. They felt punished for breathing wrong. Back in his cell, Daniel felt frustration build. He tried to read. He tried to sleep. But Attica had a way of keeping minds awake. At night, voices traveled through vents and walls. Some talked about going home someday. Others talked about revenge. Some talked about 1971 like it was yesterday. "They killed them," one voice whispered. "And nobody paid." Daniel lay still, listening. The prison was not just holding bodies. It was holding memories. Weeks passed. The investigation into the yard violence continued quietly. Officials walked the halls with notebooks. Guards answered questions carefully. Inmates were rarely asked anything. When they were, they chose their words carefully. Talking inside Attica was dangerous. Marcus warned Daniel again and again. "Keep your head down. Don't get pulled into anything." Daniel tried. But Attica made that hard. Transfers came in from New York City. Then more from Buffalo. Then Rochester again. The prison felt crowded, even when cells were not full. More people meant more tension. Daniel saw it during meals. Men stood farther apart. Conversations stopped when guards walked by. Everyone watched hands, eyes, posture. The smallest thing could turn into violence. One evening, the power flickered during count. Just a second. But the reaction was instant. Inmates froze. Guards tensed. Radios crackled all at once. Then the lights came back on. Nothing happened. But fear lingered. Marcus shook his head. "That's how it starts," he said softly. The next few days were tense. Searches increased. Cells were torn apart. Mattresses cut open. Personal letters scattered. Weapons were found in another unit. That news moved faster than anything else. Weapons meant planning. Planning meant someone believed violence was coming. The administration responded with stricter rules. Yard time shortened. Phones limited. Visits cancelled again. Inmates felt punished for something they did not do. That feeling had fueled the riot in 1971. Daniel understood that now. One morning, during a rare calm yard release, Daniel saw something unusual. A group of older inmates stood quietly near the center of the yard. They were not talking loudly. They were not fighting. They were remembering. One man whispered names under his breath. Names from 1971. Daniel felt a chill. Guards noticed too. They moved closer. The group was ordered to break apart. No one argued. But the message had been sent. The past was still alive. Later that day, an argument broke out in the showers. It started with a shove. Then fists. Guards rushed in. The fight was stopped quickly. But one man was hurt badly. The prison locked down again. This time, the lockdown felt heavier. Inside his cell, Daniel felt anger replace fear. How long could this cycle continue? Riot. Lockdown. Release. Violence. Lockdown again. Attica felt trapped inside itself. Marcus spoke less now. When he did, his voice sounded tired. They built this place to break people, he said. Then they act surprised when it does. Daniel thought about the men from 1971. How they had stood in the yard demanding basic respect. How they had been met with gunfire. That story shaped everything. Guards were trained to prevent another riot at all costs. Inmates were trained by history not to trust. That gap could not be closed easily. When the lockdown eased again, rumors spread fast. Another disturbance had happened in a different unit. Another inmate injured. Not officially confirmed. But believed. Daniel noticed guards talking more urgently now. Shift changes were tense. Extra officers appeared. The prison was bracing. One afternoon, during yard time, someone shouted from across the yard. Not an insult. A question. Did it matter? Silence followed. Everyone knew what the question meant. Did 1971 matter? Guards shouted for quiet. Someone laughed. That laugh cut through the air like glass. The yard exploded again. Not with full force. But enough. Men rushed forward. Guards charged in. Sirens screamed. Daniel ran for the fence, heart pounding. He tripped over someone who had fallen. Hands grabbed him. He pulled free. Tear gas filled the yard. Inmates dropped to the ground, coughing, choking. Guards moved fast, determined. The disturbance ended in minutes. But once again, blood marked the concrete. Inside his cell later, Daniel sat shaking. His hands would not stop trembling. Marcus spoke softly. It's not about today, he said. It never is. Daniel understood. Attica was fighting its own memory. And memory does not get tired. As night fell, the prison settled into uneasy quiet. Guards walked the tiers. Radios buzzed softly. Doors clanked. Daniel stared at the ceiling, exhausted. He realized something important. Attica was not just a prison shaped by violence. It was a prison shaped by fear of violence. And fear, when it ruled long enough, always found a way to become real again. Not with full force. But enough. Men rushed forward. Guards charged in. Sirens screamed. Daniel ran for the fence, heart pounding. He tripped over someone who had fallen. Hands grabbed him. He pulled free. Tear gas filled the yard. Inmates dropped to the ground, coughing, choking. Guards moved fast, determined. The disturbance ended in minutes. But once again, blood marked the concrete. Inside his cell later, Daniel sat shaking. His hands would not stop trembling. Marcus spoke softly. It's not about today, he said. It never is. Daniel understood. Attica was fighting its own memory. And memory does not get tired. As night fell, the prison settled into uneasy quiet. Guards walked the tiers. Radios buzzed softly. Doors clanked. Daniel stared at the ceiling, exhausted. He realized something important. Attica was not just a prison shaped by violence. It was a prison shaped by fear of violence. And fear, when it ruled long enough, always found a way to become real again. Somewhere in the prison, a man shouted in his sleep. Somewhere else, someone whispered a name from the past. And as Attica held its breath once more, Daniel knew the truth deep inside his chest. The worst part was not what had already happened. It was what the prison was still capable of doing. The yard was filled with smoke. Men ran in every direction at Attica Correctional Facility, New York, USA. Some raised their hands. Some fell to the ground. Loud gunfire echoed off concrete walls as state troopers pushed forward. Screams mixed with orders. Dust and fear filled the air. This was September 1971. This was the Attica Massacre. By the time it ended, Dozens of people were dead. Most were inmates. Many came from New York City. Blood stained the yard. The prison fell silent. And Attica was changed forever. But the story did not end that day. Because even today, more than 50 years later, Attica still lives with what happened. And inside its walls, the past is never quiet. Long before the gunfire, Attica Correctional Facility sat alone in upstate New York, far from the streets of New York City, Buffalo, and Rochester. The prison was old. The rules were strict. The cells were small. Many inmates felt forgotten. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, Attica was overcrowded. Food was poor. Medical care was limited. Punishment was harsh. Inmates complained, but no one listened. Most of the men locked inside came from cities. Many were black or Latino. Most guards were white and from nearby towns. There was little trust. Anger grew slowly. Then one day, it exploded. In September 1971, a small fight between inmates and guards turned into something bigger. Doors opened. Inmates rushed forward. Guards were overwhelmed. Keys were taken. Inmates took control of parts of the prison. More than 1,000 men gathered in the yard. They shouted demands for better food, better care, and fair treatment. Some guards were taken hostage. 4 days, the world watched. Negotiators came. Reporters listened. Inmates from New York City stood up and spoke clearly. They tried to organize. They tried to keep order. For a moment, it seemed like change might come. Then the order was given. State troopers stormed the prison. Tear gas filled the air. Gunfire followed. When it was over, 43 people were dead. Attica became a name Americans would never forget. Decades later, new inmates still arrived at Attica. The walls were the same. The memory was not. One of those inmates was Daniel Brooks. Daniel came from Buffalo, New York. He had heard about Attica his whole life. Everyone had. The riot. The deaths. The lies that came after. On his first night inside, an older inmate leaned close to him. "This place remembers," the man said. Daniel didn't understand yet. But he would. Attica in the modern day looked more controlled. Cameras were everywhere. Rules were written clearly. Guards were trained differently. But the tension remained. Daniel noticed it during count. During meals. During yard time. The way guards watched inmates. The way inmates watched guards. The past lived in the present. Attica now housed men from New York City, Buffalo, and Rochester. Each group brought its own problems. Old street fights followed people inside. City pride became prison lines. You were judged by where you came from. Daniel tried to stay quiet. He worked his job. He followed rules. He stayed alert. That was how you survived. But Attica had a way of pulling people into its pressure. Older inmates talked about 1971 in low voices. Some spoke with anger. Others with sadness. They never told the full truth, one man said. They never fixed what was broken, another said. Daniel began to see what they meant. Small arguments turned into big problems. Guards stepped in quickly, sometimes too quickly. Lockdowns came often. Phones shut off. Visits were cancelled. Every lockdown reminded inmates who had power. And who did not. One afternoon, during yard time, Daniel saw a group from New York City arguing with a group from Rochester. It started with words. Then a shove. Guards rushed in fast. Too fast. Batons came out. Orders were shouted. Inmates were forced to the ground. The yard closed. That night, Daniel lay on his bunk, heart pounding. He thought about the stories from 1971. How fear had taken over. How control had been lost. Attica felt like it was always close to that edge. The next weeks were tense. More searches. More restrictions. Weapons were found during cell checks. That scared everyone. Because weapons meant planning. And planning meant violence might not be far away. Daniel noticed guards talking more among themselves. Their faces were tight. Radios buzzed constantly. Something was coming. One night, during late count, the lights flickered. Just for a second. The tier went silent. Everyone froze. Then the lights came back on. Nothing happened. But no one slept well after that. The next morning, the yard opened late. That was never a good sign. Daniel stepped outside and felt it immediately. The air was tight. Groups formed quickly. Men whispered. Someone shouted a name from 1971. Another man answered. Guards shouted for silence. No one listened. The first punch came fast. Then another. The yard erupted. It wasn't as big as 1971. But it was real. Men ran. Fists flew. Guards rushed in. Sirens screamed. Daniel backed toward the fence, heart racing. He saw an inmate fall. He saw blood on concrete. Tear gas filled the air. Inmates dropped to the ground coughing. Guards moved in hard and fast. The fight was over in minutes. But the fear stayed. The prison locked down. Inside his cell, Daniel sat shaking. He thought about the men who had died in 1971. He thought about how the prison still reacted with force first. Some things had not changed. That night, an older inmate spoke quietly through the wall. "This is Attica," the voice said. "It never forgets." Daniel closed his eyes. Because deep down, he knew the truth. The riot in 1971 was not just history. It was a warning. And as Attica settled into uneasy silence once again, one question hung heavy in the air. If violence could still rise after all these years, what would happen next?